Hey guys, welcome back to Learn Python the Hard Way. Today we're going to focus on exercise 21 of the Learn Python the Hard Way book, and this is going to focus on the return value of functions. So as always, you're going to find the link to that current chapter in the description below. This requires a paid section of the book. If you don't have the book, just feel free to follow along with the video. So in the previous exercise, we took a look at how we can work with functions and how we can work with functions and files. And in this exercise, we're going to learn something new. We're going to learn how to return values from a function. So let's get started by actually typing out the exercise code here. And to do that, let's head over to the terminal and we can navigate to the correct folder. And from here, we can now open a new Python file. I'm using Visual Studio Code as a text editor, so to open a new file, I'm typing in code space followed by the name of the file that we want to create. So in this case, it's exercise21.py. It's a Python file, and this opens a new file, and we can get started by writing out, first of all, the function definition of the first function, which is the add function here. So first of all, we are going to use printf to actually print out adding a plus b, which are the two parameters here that we defined for the add function. So we're basically writing out adding the value for a plus the value for b. And now this is new. We're going to return a plus b, so the sum of the two values, so we can use it further in additional computations, for example. Next, let's define a subtract method, which again takes two arguments here, a and b. And we are going to use printf again to print out what it's doing. So in this case here, it's subtracting a from b. And then below that, of course, we need to return the actual value, so return a minus b. Next, let's continue with multiply. So here we're going to multiply two values, a and b. Again, we're going to use printf to write out what we're actually doing. So we're multiplying a and b. And of course, we need to return that value, a times b. And finally, we have divide, where we divide a and b. And of course, we're using printf again to divide a and b. And finally, let's return a divided by b. So these are the four different functions that we want to define. Now let's start using it. And before we actually do that, we first of all going to print out one line here. Let's do some math with just functions. So first of all, we're going to define a new variable called age, and we're going to add 30 to 5, which is the first function we defined. After that, we define height, and we call the subtract function. And I just mistyped that, so let's call it subtract. Like this. And we're going to subtract 4 from 78. We define the weight, which is calculated by multiplying 90 and 2. And then we define IQ, which is the divide function, and we divide 100 by 2 here. Quite a low IQ. So let's continue with printing out the values for the different variables here. So age, and we use printf again to render the different variable values directly in here in our print statement. Height, and again we use the variable height, and all of that of course in curly braces, so it's properly rendered, properly displayed. Weight, and then finally IQ. And finally here at the end, we're going to add a comment, a puzzle for extra credit. type it in anyway. So first of all, we are going to type out or print out, here is a puzzle, followed by a new variable called what. And now we're calling our add function that we defined before, and we're going to pass a value of h to it, which is a variable we defined up here. And now we are going to add another function in here as a second parameter, or as a second argument, which is a subtract function. And the subtract function is going to take the height that we have in here and another function called multiply. And this again takes as a first argument the weight, and as a second argument the divide function, which now takes the value of IQ and the number 2. So we're using a bunch of different functions in here, the add function, the subtract function, the multiply function, and the divide function. So all 4 of our functions that we defined in a single line, and the value of that will be assigned to what. And finally, let's print out the value. That becomes colon, and then we type in what. And finally, can you do it by hand? All right. So this is the exercise code for this exercise. Let's just save that real quick. And let's take a look what's actually going on here. So we defined 4 different functions: add, subtract, multiply, and divide. And the important change to the previous exercises is that we are using the return statement. So for example, return a plus b for the add function, or for example, return a divided by b for the divide function. And this does the following. Our function is called with 2 arguments, a and b. For example, down here, if we take a look at the add function here that we are using, we pass in 2 different arguments, and of course add is defined up here. Then we print out what the function is doing, in this case, for example, adding, if we use the add function. So if we call add 30 and 5, it would print out adding 30 plus 5. And then we tell Python here to return the addition of a plus b. So we, in this case, for example, when we call add 35, it adds 30 and 5, so 35, and that is then returned from that function. And finally, once that is returned, it is stored here in this variable. So h, now when we call it with the values of 30 and 5, actually has a value of 35. All right, so let's get ahead and actually open the terminal again, and let's run our code. So we're going to type in Python 3 and then the name of the text file, the Python file that we just created, so exercise21.py. Let's press enter and compare it to the actual solution output that we should see. So first of all, we see, let's do some math with just functions, which is the print statement here. Next, we call the add function on 30 and 5. So therefore, since we're calling add here, and add is printing out adding and then the input values, it's printing out adding 30 plus 5, and that stores it in the variable. Next, we call the subtract function and assign the output to height. And since we call subtract, again, it's printing out subtracting a minus b. So in this case, subtracting 78 minus 4, and that's stored in the height variable. And the same happens for multiply and divide. So here we see multiplying 90 times 2 and dividing 100 by 2. After that, after we define those variables and of course also printed out those operations that we perform, we now have this print statement here where we're using printf to actually pass the values that we calculated before into that one line to actually embed it and print it out in the same line. So here we see h colon 35, which is the value that we calculated here, height 74, weight 180, and IQ 50. And then finally, here's the print statement, here's the puzzle. So in this statement here, we are actually using all 4 operations: add, subtract, multiply, and divide. And in Python and in programming languages in general, when we execute such a statement, we would of course follow the order of operations. So in this case here, divide would be executed first. It's a furthest into this operation pretty much. So first of all, we're dividing IQ by 2. And since we are calling divide, and of course we have that print statement in here, it's first of all printing out dividing 50 divided by 2, which is the value of IQ that we defined before here, where we divided 100 by 2. And then we pass in the value of 2 as well to divide. So here we have dividing 50 by 2. If we take a look at that and go one further to the left, so we are reading basically from the right to the left, we can see that multiply is called next. So it's basically one level out of this operation that is in the parentheses. So we have multiply next, and we are multiplying the weight with the result of divide, which again was the IQ was the value of 50, and we passed in 2 as well, so it's a value of 25. And we multiply a weight, which is here the value of multiplying 90 by 2, so 180, multiplied by 25, which again is the output of the previous operation, dividing 50 by 2. One level further out, we have subtract, and here we subtract the height and the result of calling multiply, and of course divide here. So in this case, height, we calculated that here before. So we have subtract 74, which is the output that we set here previously, that we calculated before, minus, and then as a result of multiplying those values here, which was the operation here before, 180 times 25, so we have 74 minus 4,500. And finally now if we go one further to the outside, one further to the left, we are adding the value of h, which is a value of 35, with the calculation that we did before. So we add 35 to the result of subtracting 74 minus 4,500, so that is minus 4,426. And then at the very end we say print that becomes, we pass in the variable what, which is the result of adding 35 and minus 4,426, so minus 4,391. And finally we have, can you do it by hand? So that's basically the output of our Python file that we just defined. So let's take a look now at the different study drill sections. So first of all, if you aren't really sure what return does, try writing a few of your own functions and have them return some values. You can return anything that you can put to the right of an equal sign. So what we can do here is, instead of just having add, subtract, multiply, and divide, we could, for example, go ahead and let's say we want to define a power function, and we want to take a to the power of b. And now in a similar way, we could, for example, initially just print out what it does. So we can, for example, say a to the power of b. And now we would go ahead and say return a, and then 2 asterisks to take it to the power of b. Let's save that. And then at the very end, for example, we can call our function here and say we have, let's just call it result. And we call power, and let's pass in 2 and 3. And then finally we can say we want to print out the result using printf. And we pass in the value for result. All right, let's go ahead and let's run our code one more time. And here we see, since we called power 2, 3, we call here 2 to the power of 3, and 2 to the power of 3 is 8, which is the result we're printing out. And so again, since we called the power function here with 2 and 3, at the end here, when we have the return statement, we actually return that value, so 2 to the power of 3 that is being returned. It's saved in the result variable, and we finally print it out using printf. So let's take a look at the next study duel section here. At the end of the script is a puzzle. I'm taking the return value of one function and using it as the argument for another function. So for example, if we just scroll to that place again, we have here multiply, for example, which takes as an input weight, and then the result of calling the divide function with IQ and 2. I'm doing this in a chain so that I'm kind of creating a formula using the function. It looks really weird, but if you run the script, you can see the results. What you should do is try to figure out the normal formula that would recreate the same set of operations. Right, so we briefly did that before. So just to recap real quick, if we, for example, take a look at the right-hand section here, multiply, weight, and divide, IQ and 2. What this basically does is it's multiplying, if we just type that section out here, so it would be multiply and the input is weight. And then if you evaluate here the result of what's happening when we call divide with the input of IQ and 2, what's happening here is the value of IQ, which is the result of calling divide with the input of 102, so 50. So we have 50 divided by 2. So that would be the input of multiply. And then if we just take a look at what that would equal to, so weight actually is the result of calling multiply with the input of 90 and 2, or with the arguments of 90 and 2. So that would be 180. And now we have as a second input the result of dividing 50 by 2. So that would be 25. So again, the result here would be multiply with 180 and 25, so it would be 180 times 25. And in a similar step, we would go further to the left and take that result here, multiplying 100 times 25 along with height as the input for subtract, and the result of that would be used as an argument that we pass to add along with age, which we saw previously when we took a look at that. So that's basically how that works, and while it's a little bit of a complicated way to write it, it can be quite handy using those kind of functions and passing that as an argument to an existing function, so we can do more complex calculations. So, and finally we have study duel number 4, do the inverse, write a simple formula and use the functions in the same way to calculate it. So if we go here to the bottom and we have our new formula. So let's say, for example, we have 10 plus 3, the result of which, let's say, should be multiplied with, let's say, the value of h. Let me just turn that into a comment. So if you want to calculate that using our functions that we defined before, let's do that by calling, first of all, multiply, which is the operation here on the left. So we call multiply with the input of h here. And then after that, we want to also pass in the sum of 10 and 3. So we can use our add function. And now we can type in the value of 10 and 3. And of course, we could make that more complicated if we want to add something here up front, for example, to divide the result by something, then we could just add on top of that, but that's basically how we would approach that. And again, we can store that in a variable. So I'm just going to call it output, and then we could go ahead and just call print on it, passing in f to actually render our variable value, to embed that directly in our string, and then we could say output. And now we have the output value. Let's save that. Let's head back to our terminal here so we can execute the code one more time. And what we are looking for now is here at the very end after result, which was the previous output that we added. After that, we have adding 10 and 3, which is the result of calling add 10 and 3, of course. And right to the outside of it, we have multiplying 35 and 13, which is the result of adding 10 and 3. So that would be printed out by the multiply function, the value of which is stored in output, and that's what we're printing out at the end. So here we have an output of 455 which is of course the result of multiplying 35 with 13. So that's how we can also work the other way around, actually start with a formula and then using our functions to properly map that. All right, and finally we have some common student questions. So first of all, why does Python print the formula or the functions backward? So if we take a look here, for example, at this statement here, and we take a look at the output one more time. That is the section here. It doesn't start with printing out adding here, but instead it starts with dividing, then with multiplying, subtracting, and adding. So it basically starts here on the right side and works its way outside. So why is that? So when you start breaking down the function into separate formulas and function calls, you'll see how it works. Try to understand what I mean by inside out rather than backwards. So that's basically what we talked about. So here we have those different parentheses, and of course we would start basically at the right side in the innermost section here, and we start with the divide operation. Then we move our way to the left, one level out, to multiply, to subtract, to add. And that's why we start with having the print statement here, divide. So in general, we always execute the code from the right to the left. And of course, we also pay attention to the order of operation with the parentheses that are provided. How can I use input to enter my own values? So we learned about input in some of the previous exercises. Input is really handy to get some user input and then to do some calculations, for example, with that user input. So, and the important thing is, if we use input and we provide some values, that would be added as a string. So we need to turn it into, for example, an integer to do some calculations. So that's why we have to use int, and then we pass input to it. So we would turn the input that we get as a string into an integer to do some calculations. The problem with that is that then you can't enter floating point numbers. So for example, before, when we did some multiplications or divisions, for example with IQ, we had a value of 50.0. We take another look at that here. For example, we have dividing 50.0 because when we divide two values, we generally get a floating point number. And then if we turn that into an int, we may lose some precision, because int would basically ignore whatever is after the dot. So here, if instead of having a value of 50.0, we had a value of 50.3, for example, and we turn that into an int, we would just basically chop off, if you will, the value after the dot. So we would basically lose some of the precision. It would store the value of 50.3 as 50. And to avoid that, we can, instead of calling int on the input, we can use float. And it would store it as a floating point number, so as a number with a decimal separator and with some digits after the dot. And finally, what do you mean by write out a formula? So for example, try out 24 plus 34 divided by 100 minus 1023 as a start. Convert that to use a function. Now come up with your own similar math equation and use variables so it's more like a formula. So that's equivalent to what we did before here. So we basically wrote that out as a formula, and then we turned that into a function using that. So finally, we can just do that one more time using precisely the statement here. So 24 plus 34 divided by 100 minus 1023. So we could start here and say, for example, we want to, on the left side here, add the value of 24, and then if we just continue that, the result of the statement here on the right side. So we would say here next we divide, so we say divide, and we pass in the value of 34, and then on the right side here we have the calculation of 100 minus 102, so that would be subtract function, and here we pass in 100 and 1023. So that's basically how we can break this down into another statement, and that of course would just start here at the very right and subtract 1023 from 100, then continue to divide our output that we got here So divide 34 by the output we calculated, and finally we would add 24 to that output. And that would just be breaking it down and basically executing it from left to right. So if we compare that to a mathematical operation, it would look something like this, because in this case we are subtracting 1023 from 100, and then we basically do this division. Otherwise, of course, division would be executed first. So that's how we break this down, and that's basically what we did here before when we worked through that. So that's it for exercise 21, and see you guys in the next video with exercise 22.